Hi, thanks so much for joining me today. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that my mission is to seek out and chat with some of the musical stars of the 60s, 70s and 80s. I'm always keen to take your requests, and I follow my nose too in recalling some of the songs and artists that shaped my own youth. Fire from 60s British rocker Arthur Brown, who set the world alight in 1968. The flamboyant and theatrical performer became known not only as the god of Hellfire, but as the forerunner of face paint, elaborate costumes and dramatic lighting. So many bands have copied him since. Let's meet him, shall we? Arthur Brown, how are you?
Doing really well, thank you.
So everybody knows you for that incredible hit Fire. That was when you had the band The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. Tell us a little bit about that band.
Well, it came out of a desire to open a multimedia club because I'd come across various clubs in Italy and France where there were one club had stalagmites and stalactites, and you sit in amongst them all. And I just thought, a surreal multimedia club is what I'd like to open, but I couldn't raise the money for it. So I thought, well, I'll have a multimedia band then. So from that came the idea. We did a live show, and the visual became important, and then started adding, costumes and some flames. That was going down well. And then Pete Townsend came down and took us to his record company. They said, well, we need to hear what we can do in the studio. So Pete took us out to his studio and we did the demos. And then we did the album. And by that time, I developed it into the story of the person going down, going through the flames and all of that, and the world in chaos and stuff. People were not used to that kind of lyric. So if we make the lyrics supported by the costumes and it becomes a character, then they will probably be able to more accept it. So that was the beginning of the whole theatrical thing. And we played down UFO Club, and the other bands that were there at that time were Soft Machine and Pink Floyd, and various other people came down as it got more and more popular. We went and did the Alexandra Palace, and I remember my manager of the day, Kit Lambert, coming to the entrance, and it had double doors. So you got one lot of doors, you go through, and there's another lot. He came to the 14-hour Technicolor Dream.
The 14-hour Technicolor Dream featured Pink Floyd headlining. The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, Pete Townsend, Graham Bond, Savoy Brown and Yoko Ono were also on the bill. But back to our story about Arthur Brown's manager trying to gain entry.
The bouncer on the door said, well, I don't care who you say you are. Where's your ticket? And he said, but I'm his manager. He's one of the people playing here. So I don't care. So at that moment, he was asked to deal with another matter. So he turned round to deal with that. And Kit Lambert leapt into the doorway and started running for the second door. And so the guy ran over and laid him out on the floor. Next morning, he walked into his office and the people said, well, you've got a big black eye, Kit. Where have you been? He said, I've been to a love-in.
Arthur Brown,
Yeah.
who were you before you became the god of Hellfire? Where did you concoct all these crazy ideas from?
Well, some of them are concocted in Paris, where I did a residency, which was the sort of early days of the English R&B scene. The psychedelic scene was creeping in. And because we had a residency and we played every day of the week and twice on Sundays, we didn't get a lot of time to rehearse. So we played the same numbers, but we started to elongate them and then do little skits. And then other things came in,
But had you always had this love for theatre?
Well, when I was little, I played King Alfred, burning the cakes. And then at Reading University, I did some drama, but it was also singing. And so that went down really well. Although I was singing what I thought was a serious song, but all the audience were laughing. So I realized, oh, well, if I enlarged the kind of thing they were laughing at, and they laughed even more. And then when I was in school, before that, one of our books was Murder in the Cathedral by
Oh, yeah.
T.S. Eliot. And that was a kind of eye-opener for me because they played it under normal lighting until it came to the point where Beckett gets murdered in the cathedral. And at that point, they turned everything red. So the whole of the stage, because it was blood, obviously, from him being murdered. But I just thought, wow, that's an amazing capacity just to take lights and make people shock or feel good. There were things like that that just popped into my consciousness and I retained them. Some of them I did use on stage. If you have a character, then you dress the character. And our technology has kept changing and developing the ability to do things visually.
You were certainly way ahead of your time, weren't you?
Yeah, I suppose so. I suppose so. There weren't many people doing anything like that. And for instance, in New York, in the crazy world, we put one of the people who'd come up with the small faces as one of their tour managers, but he had such great ideas. We put him on the lighting and he just treated it differently to all the other lights people. In those days, lighting was just spot and it was very minimal, but he would take the whole lighting console and then bang it in time with the music, which nobody had ever seen, and turn on the strobes. And so it became a thing that we would just experiment for fun. And then if it got a reaction, found a way to put it in so it meant something in the drama. It was equally scary in some part. And I began to realize that the dramatic element could then be translated into taking rock song and making the structure of the music dramatic as well, so that there was a tension in the music and in the lyrics and in the lighting and in the way that the thing was sung. That came on the scene, and then a lot of people saw that it was being successful. A lot of music bands started to experiment.
To follow, yeah, follow suit. Well, of course, you were working in a time where it was really fertile ground, wasn't it? Nothing like that had been seen before, and everybody was really open to all this experimentation. So the reaction you were getting was huge, wasn't it?
It was, yes, yes, and it was equally because the audience was kind of open and expecting things to be done that weren't done before. That enabled us to do things that weren't there before, rather than the audience going, "Oh gosh, why do they do that?" They said, "No, wow, that was great. Keep doing it." That was more the early time because later it got to be formalized and people did have particular expectations.
It became known as psychedelic rock, and it was music that dared to go where no other had gone before. It was a sound that captivated the hearts and minds of a generation, igniting a cultural revolution that changed the world forever. We've already talked about the time that it was, a period of great social upheaval, with young people rebelling against the conformity and conservative materialism of the post-war era. The wild music coincided with the embrace and use of mind-altering drugs and the exploration of new realms of consciousness. Artists like Arthur Brown celebrated the power of the imagination and rejected the conventions of mainstream rock and roll.
Then there were people who took their own direction from all of that, like Alice Cooper took it and made his art out of it, and he's got his own artistic approach to it. Bruce Dickinson took his way, and various other people, even
Oh,
George
Kiss,
Clinton.
George Clinton, yeah.
Yeah, he came down to, and he said, from then on, I knew where I was going because it meant his whole type of extreme stage show was, he saw that was a thing that could be possible now. Whereas he had been playing doo-wop music because that was what was possible then. And this was a different time when people were open to ideas, new philosophies, new ways of looking at society, new ways of looking at everything, actually.
Were you flattered with them all taking your lead, or did you feel like they were just copying you?
I thought there were some bands that just copied it, but mainly they did take it all on their own direction. And of course, one of the beauties of what became known as prog rock, although it was progressive music to begin with, was that each band had their own way that they made music differently than anybody else, and the sounds of all the bands were different, and
You know,
the kind of structures were different.
the sounds were different, but in terms of wearing the makeup, you were the originator of that. And bands like Alice Cooper and Kiss, for instance, just took that and ran with it. So, although they were making very different music, they had copied that whole theatrical look, hadn't they?
Yeah, they did. But then, if you look at me, I there were things in, for instance, one thing I didn't mention when you said, well, where did you get your ideas theatrically? It wasn't necessarily in theatre, or it was a form of theatre like, say, ritual dancing on videos made by people going out to see the tribes in at that time in Africa, and seeing the witch doctors and all of that stuff. I was very influenced in my dancing and in the visual type of approach. And so I was watching people doing music, but in a different way. I wasn't just watching music hall and English and European stuff. It was music from all over.
Just going back to Fire, the single, and that amazing burning helmet that you made your moniker. If you could share a couple of the mishaps that happened along the way with that as you were experimenting.
As with lots of things, there are chance things that happen. And I remember we were in Montmartre doing this residency in Paris. We used to have some wild parties there. And somebody one night, when I woke up and opened my door, there was a crown on the floor with candles in it. And so I took it down to the club that night and wore it and lit the candles, and everybody, "Oh." And so when we got to do the fire theme, and I'd written the poem that comes just before fire. I was lying in the grass, and the grass turns to sand, the river turns to the sea, and then it all bursts into flame, and that leads into fire. I wrote that one when I was probably about 15. So I'd already got that interest in fire and flame and light quite early on. And my father had introduced me to meditation when I was young. So when it came to doing the first album, well, that was what was most in my mind. So I put an image of fire on everything. And fire can be something that burns you, but then the burning can be to get rid of all the crap you attach to yourself by what way you think, by the way you're taught, by whatever. So the hellfire flames that's what they were to do. And of course it needed figures for that. So the God of Hellfire became the song. And then it was like, well, okay, if we're going to do that, then we need to amplify the visual side of it, of the character. And so, because the older pagan religions were into horns, etc., we had the two horns with flames coming out of them. Before the horns, I was wearing a pie dish because the candles broke after a while. And so the dish was filled with petrol, and the roadie would throw lighted things into it until it exploded, usually.
There were a
But
couple of mishaps along the way, though, weren't there?
oh, lots, yeah, burnt ceilings, stages, my clothes, my hair. It's one of the gigs. My clothes caught fire. Another performer had two glasses of Newcastle Brown that he was carrying to. So he put me out
With the beer.
yeah.
What was it that intrigued you so much about fire? When did the fascination begin?
Well, it had several things. One is that when I was born, it was the Second World War, and we were living in the East End of London. The bombing hit that part of London very powerfully. So the house we were living in there was bombed, and it exploded while my mother had me and my brother out in the pram. And suddenly there was this big explosion, and the house was gone, and everything on that street was in flames. And of course, I only have very fleeting memories of it, but the feelings, the people around me, and affected me quite deeply as a child, obviously. And then we moved. My grandma had a hotel in Yorkshire, and that was blown up as well. But in the meantime, there was no TV, and so a lot of the time I spent listening to the grandfather clock. And at night, you had to have black curtains drawn across the window without any little gaps, because if you had little shafts of light coming out, the bombers would come and bomb that house. So you sit there in the dark and listen to the clock. Sometimes you'd have the coal fire going. Then I used to spend lots of time just looking at the flames. It was very hypnotic.
How incredible that those experiences were to shape your entire life.
Yeah, yeah.
Arthur Brown, that very first album that you did when you were becoming the pioneer of shock rock and progressive rock, I Put a Spell on You by Screamin' Jay Hawkins.
Oh, yes.
Share a little bit about that.
Well, it was the version by Nina Simone that first got me. It was such a wonderful, powerful, moving, a horror song, a terror song, a love song that showed me how you could be extreme and really full of passion in the performance of things. It allowed the full range of my voice to come out. You know, I'd taken classical lessons and I like to really throw the voice about, and that was a song that allowed you to do it.
Arthur, I wanted to talk to you also about the fact that you were one of the first rock acts to use the drum machine, again being a pioneer.
Yes, I do like, new ideas. So that was in the 71. It was my third band, really, Kingdom Come. It was called Arthur Brown Kingdom Come. And it was quite an experimental band. And
I'm not surprised by that.
But one time we'd had a series of drummers coming through. Some of them were excellent. Some of them couldn't stand props and the theatre. So we came to a point where one of them had just run off with our van. And the idea came up of, why don't we do it without the drummer? Because we had some experimental sound equipment. Everything was changing in the sound world then. And so we'd had trouble governing the sound of the drums. Say, like the guitarist wanted to play gently and the drummer's whacking away, you quite often can't hear the guitarist because he's playing softly. We thought, well, why don't we take a machine, strip down the band, and try and make it like the equivalent in rock of a string quartet. Not that kind of music, obviously, but the simplicity of it and the fact that with a drum machine, you can control the volume on stage. In those days, the drum machines were not like they are now. So there was a lot more limitation on what you could actually play. But because we also had the synthesizer with patch boards and wires that you put into it, but it also had a joystick. So we were able to create all these space sounds.
Wow.
And the combination of that with the drum machine gave us a very unusual sound. And then the guitarist was able to be either very fruity and lyrical or almost vicious.
Right. I think the track Time Captives really captures that sound, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. We took a guitar piece and then we recorded the five guitars over each other, just playing but on different notes and interlocked at different times. Developed the visual side of it later after that.
Arthur's experimental music tantalised audiences. Instead of simple chord progressions and catchy hooks, it favoured complex structures, intricate instrumentation, and an emphasis on effects and studio techniques. Today, more than half a century later, countless bands and artists continue to draw inspiration from what he and other pioneers of this groundbreaking genre began. Arthur Brown quickly developed a cult following, but the mix of special effects, dramatic costumes and colourful theatrics was often highly controversial. Arthur was determined to become acceptable to the mainstream and to finally make a reality his dream of staging a true multimedia show.
We decided one thing we would like to do would be a tour of the schools, the young people. This one headmaster said, okay, come to my school. The pupils were about 11, 12. So we put on the drum machine and everything, and they went absolutely crazy for it. They loved it.
Arthur, in 75, you appeared in the Who's rock opera Tommy.
The movie Tommy included a number of celebrities: Anne Margaret, Jack Nicholson, Oliver Reed, Elton John, Tina Turner, Eric Clapton, and of course Arthur Brown. This wasn't the only time that Arthur crossed paths with The Who. That band later covered Fire on their album The Iron Man, the musical by Pete Townsend. Since then, Marilyn Manson, The Ventures, Death Grips, Cathedral and Ozzy Osbourne have all covered or sampled that song.
You contributed vocals to the Alan Parsons Project song The Telltale Heart. And in 1979, you actually moved to Africa and lived there for 6 months. You directed the Burundi National Orchestra, which is a 9-piece rock group that played Jimi Hendrix songs as well as local music.
Yeah, I really wanted to find somebody who could really do the dances with all the knowledge of the witch doctors. I never did, but I taught at a school there. So I brought in some of the ancient instruments and the older people to play them. And people were just about to go out and see a blues concert. And I said, well, do you know where the rhythms come from? And they said, yeah, America. I said, no, they come from around here. The original rhythms that they're playing in the rock bands, a lot influenced by all the African rhythms. For instance, some of the ones from Burundi where I was what Adam and Ant based their stuff on.
Really?
Yeah, were very influential on them.
King of the Wild Frontier was the first single by Adam and the Ants to feature the two-drummer Burundi beat, for which the band became famous. It was also the first written by Adam Ant and Marco Pirono in what would become their successful songwriting partnership. It was the early 80s, and Arthur left the UK to settle in Austin, Texas, where he earned a degree in counselling and opened a music-based practice. He also opened a house painting and carpentry business with Jimmy Carl Black, who'd been a former member of Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention. He and Jimmy later teamed up to release Brown, Black and Blue, a powerful blues rock set, in 1988.
In 2002, you supported Robert Plant on his Dreamland tour. In 2003, you worked with Mark Brzezicki of the band Big Country, and you released Vampire Suite, an album with him.
After that album, Arthur became a regular guest at Hawkwind concerts. In the 2010s, a spate of archival live releases dominated his catalogue, and he continued to tour extensively with Carl Palmer's Emerson, Lake and Palmer Legacy Tour. 2022 saw Arthur Brown celebrate his 80th birthday with the release of a new album.
It's an album of really celebrating my roots in jazz, rock, and blues. So that's but they're all different, the songs. and it has the title song is it's the long road, and it's kind of the long road that I've got in music, the long road, human history, where they repeat the same errors all the way through and end up, beating each other up as a way of living. But it is our presentation of it. It is my dream multimedia show, and it was what I was wanting to do in that band that did Time Captains, but we didn't have the technology.
So today you've got the technology to do exactly what you want.
Yeah, and we've got an amazing visual show. And what we've done is take the music from different periods through my career, and that's also the long road. And then we've developed it and made it in. It is a story, and it is a piece of theatre, and I think it's really beautiful. It's got a lot of energy. I think it's a piece of art. Some people say art fart, but I think art. This art is beautiful.
It comes as 2 CDs and a book, is that right?
Yeah, it's got vinyl, CDs, the book, and lots of different. It's a box set.
It's the definitive Arthur Brown collection.
Well, the box set is not the live set that we do. The live set is the multimedia show. And of course, we do some of this new album in that show. But this album harks back to when I was mainly involved jazz, blues, and rock, and brings it into the present. So the show has some of it in it, but the show is not the new album.
Okay. So it's called The Long Road. Can you point to your favourite track on there apart from the title track?
Oh, well, I'd have to say, Once I Had Illusions, it's called. It's quite a hefty piece.
Once you did have illusions, didn't you? And look where they got you.
Yeah. I do have to regulate things a little more. I can still get the notes and sing all of that, but I have a different way of doing it now. I used to do all the throwing of myself around and energy. What I do now is let the energy come out by itself.
You still love it as much as you ever did?
Yes.
And congratulations on all your successes, Arthur Brown. I just think you're wonderful. I'd like nothing better than to have the opportunity to see your new show.
Let's hope everybody who's listening to your program writes to somebody and says, we need to get this guy over here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time. And I guess in your case, there's something to be thankful about World War II, because Arthur Brown, the god of Hellfire, wouldn't have been that without all the fire that you saw in your early days.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it, how all that works out in time and history and life. Thank you for taking the time.